Good morning and welcome. I'm Lawrence Upton. I'm Programme Manager for the Leading Within a Group programme, and in today's webinar we want to give you a comprehensive overview of the programme, highlighting how a unique combination of executive education, executive coaching and peer networks can help you enhance your leadership skills and be transformative for you and your business. So what we'll be covering this morning, I'll provide a brief introduction to Leading Within a Group. You'll then hear from our programme directors for Executive Education, Paul Lyons from the Irish Management Institute, and Executive Coaching, Paula Wilson from Wilson Sloan Consulting. You'll also hear from a previous participant, Mark O'Connell from Evercode NI Limited, about his programme journey, and finally a short Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. The mics will be muted as we present. However, we would definitely welcome hearing from you. So if you have a question as we go along, please submit this via the chat function and we'll come to those during the Q&A. So in today's fast-paced and evolving business environment, effective leadership is more critical than ever because business as usual simply isn't an option. Change is the only constant, and the pace of change is increasing, presenting many challenges for leaders. However, skilled, effective leadership can be a strong enabler for a higher performing team, better productivity, faster innovation, clearer strategy, and stronger growth. To be successful, leaders need to stay agile, adapt to change, and invest in keeping their skills current. So this morning, we hope to show you how participating and leading within a group could be the right choice to help you achieve all of that. So Leading Within a Group has been running since 2018 with 45 companies participating in 5 cohorts, one cohort running just at the moment, and you can see the logos of participating companies on screen now. Though we have a proven model for the programme, as you will see in a moment, we do look to refresh the content to keep it current and stay across emerging leadership trends, and also to ensure that it's relevant to the companies participating on that specific cohort. We also recently introduced a new delivery partner for executive education in the Irish Management Institute. The Leading Within a Group programme's USP is that it is designed specifically for senior leaders and site leads of Northern Ireland companies, of subsidiaries of international companies. Leading Within a Group is differentiated from Invest NI's other leadership programs and many leadership programs out there in that it specifically recognises that you as leaders operating within a wider group or global structure have a different dynamic going on. That may be in terms of how decision making happens, in terms of communication and influencing, in terms of team leadership and performance, and all these things challenge you as leaders. Perhaps I could describe it in some senses as thinking global, but acting local. On screen is an illustration of the current Leading Within a Group programme journey. It's a blended learning experience comprising executive education with the Irish Management Institute, commencing with a launch event and keynote speaker, two-day executive education residentials, a mentor panel, and a programme finale. And Paul will be providing more insight on all of that in a moment. And executive coaching, Wilson Sloan Consulting, 22.5 hours of coaching support, including diagnostics and psychometric testing. And Paula will illustrate the impact that coaching can have very shortly. And also facilitated peer networks, and that's where you will work with other leaders facing similar challenges, providing you with an opportunity to engage, learn, share experiences, and identify potential business growth opportunities. So what can you or your organization achieve through participating in the program? Our aim is to boost your leadership impact and presence at the subsidiary level, increase your strategic influence across your group, and to help you to develop a strategic vision that drives growth in your business. But importantly, the scope and flexibility is there for you to use the resources of the program to help you achieve your specific objectives as a leader. Just as an example, in an external evaluation of the program in 2023, previous participants talked about having much greater confidence, strategic and self-awareness, better decision-making, team management, direction, delegation, and influencing skills. So we think we're delivering on what we set out to do. On screen are two recent pre-dinner speakers at the residentials for the program. Mark Pollock, an international motivational speaker, explorer, and author, and also the first blind man to race to the South Pole, a very, very nice guy. And we also had Neil O'Brien, another very motivational speaker, who talks about mental fitness and optimal performance in business and in sport. And that's just another dimension of the program. So I'd just like to share at this point some great feedback on leading within a group from Tiernan Moran, the Chief Operating Officer of Deloitte Northern Ireland and a current participant on leading within a group. And you can see that on screen. So just to get into a bit more detail on the program structure and content, I'd like to introduce Paul Lyons from the Irish Management Institute, Program Director for Executive Education on the program. Paul.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, and good morning, everybody. So, as Lawrence said, I represent the Irish Management Institute, who were recently chosen as the delivery partner for the thought elements of the program, and we're just in the process of finishing our first cohort under this delivery model. Those of you who may not be familiar with the Irish Management Institute, let me give a brief introduction. It is a membership organisation primarily, with members north and south, established over 70 years ago. It's a business school that is globally ranked. But the delivery model that's used is to use a network of associates, people who are experts in their fields, who are brought in to teach on the various topics and subjects that the Irish Management Institute delivers education on. And that ranges, as the bottom of this slide says, from executive education, design and delivery, master classes, master's programs, and customized offerings such as the Leading Within a Group program that is specifically designed and tailored for the needs of groups of companies. Now, given the nature of companies, both north and south, we have a higher representation of subsidiaries, of multinational subsidiaries, and they have specific needs that we have developed a capability on. Lauren showed you a set of logos for companies who attended the Leading Within a Group program so far. We've also been running a not dissimilar program for companies south of the border, and here are the 40 or so companies who've attended that in the last 5 years. Now, the reason I show this slide is to allow you to see the range of companies who've had who benefit from these programs. Here you have companies in all sectors. We have services companies, manufacturing companies, large and small. We've some with as little as 5 or 6 employees at the moment, some with thousands of employees, some who are really established for many years and some who are very new, some that are acquisitions that have been brought into a multinational structure, and others that have grown organically. So they're all very different, just as every company on this call is different. But what we have found is that they have a lot in common as well. First of all, they're all successful. They have survived, or they are developing. So they're not coming on a program like this because they're in danger generally. So they're successful. They're ambitious. They want to add more value to their multinational parents. They feel there is opportunity to add that value. They want to find ways of identifying and challenging that value. They want to create new opportunities for their staff, for their communities. So they're all very ambitious and successful. They are also, I would say, increasingly conscious of the changing world that they're operating in. And Lawrence mentioned this, but it's all the more important now. And we're seeing an increasing understanding from companies that really things are changing. There are the visible things like the geopolitical issues we see with tariffs and tensions across the world, but there are also changes in the way people work. You know, the whole home working has changed the way, particularly services companies operate and use resources across borders. So that's changed things. And there's also in the background AI progressively happening. So all of these companies are thinking about, what does this mean for us? How do we take the initiative in this changing environment to develop a strategy where we can deliver that extra value and create more potential for our people? So the emphasis is on the subsidiary, and I'll bring you back to this slide that Lawrence presented, and I'll walk you through it in a little bit more detail to give you an understanding of how the program is structured. We start with a launch event, which allows people to get to know each other, the participants to get to know each other. We have some keynote speakers on what's happening in the world. And we use that event also to get a better understanding of what each company is seeking to achieve out of the program. The backbone of the program, of the delivered portions of the program, are the residential events. The first one focuses on two elements: strategic subsidiary leadership and value proposition development. So this starts with an analysis and providing companies with the tools to analyze their environment, to understand where their strengths are, where their opportunities are, what they should focus on, what they shouldn't focus on. On day one is an analysis piece, and day two is more about a value proposition development. Given that, where can we deliver most value to our parent company? The second residential is more focused on the actions that can be taken to orchestrate and execute a strategy. A key element of that is talent, because the one thing that subsidiary leaders can control more directly is their talent, who they promote, how they develop people, what they really want to be famous for in terms of delivering talent to their parent. And the most important, or equally importantly, the second day is on strengthening stakeholder networks. Subsidiaries don't operate in a market, in an open market like other companies. They need support from stakeholders within the company to get extra investment, to get support for the ideas that they may be developing. So we spend a lot of time talking about identifying and developing stakeholders on that residential. So those two activities, are those two residentials. They're not isolated events, because in between times we have coaching, which Paula will talk about in a few minutes. So companies are assigned a coach which helps them work with those ideas and develop those ideas, and particularly understand the leadership requirements to orchestrate those ideas. And we have peer learning activities between the participants where they would debate and tease out various issues and learn from each other. All of that culminates towards the end in what we call Road Test Your Plan, and that is where we bring in mentors, experienced subsidiary leaders, largely retired from some quite significant companies, to sit on the panel and hear what the participants have included. So every participant privately will present to this panel about what their thoughts are, and we'll use them as an additional source of counseling and coaching about how to develop their plans. And ultimately, we get together in a growth presentation where the companies share with each other what their learning journey has been. And as Lawrence says, that's all backed up by executive coaching throughout the program. So that gives you hopefully a sense of the content. But I just wanted to make an additional point about the style of delivery. I refer to this as a program, not a course. It's not about being taught something. It's a program of learning. We refer to the people who attend as participants, not as students or delegates. because it's a collaborative process. It's, of course, if you look at the center of this chart, of course, it gives us a forum where you can learn from experts, people who we bring in who know about strategy or value proposition or talent or subsidiary or stakeholder development. So you can learn from those experts, but you also have the opportunity to learn from your peers. Despite the diversity of companies who you would typically have in any of these programs, there's great opportunity to learn from other companies, even in different industries. And of course, there's a large part of learning from yourself, giving you the opportunity to step back. We know that all of the people on this call don't often have time to step back, to think, to reflect, to make plans, because you're so busy with the day-to-day operations. So the ethos is very much about you as participants, giving you things to think about, giving you time to reflect on those things, working with the coaches to tease those out and understand the relevance of them, providing you with the diagnostic frameworks that give you some structure for developing those ideas, all with the objective of producing a deliverable, which is a key element of the program. It's not only a skill development learning experience, it's about producing a deliverable, which is a plan for your organization going forward. Now, I've referred a couple of times to the coaching element, which is key to it. So I'd like to hand over to Paula, who will describe how the coaching process operates. Paula, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be on with you guys, and hopefully as we are starting to talk through the programme, things are resonating. Don't forget to populate the chat if you have any questions so that we can interact with you at the close of this particular webinar. So I just want to explain how the coaching operates. We've been working on this programme since its inception in 2018, and it's fabulous. I have to say it's really enjoyable to work with such diverse companies, all of whom have this one piece in common, which is that they have a parent somewhere globally with whom they're engaging. Wilson's Law Consulting has over 20 years experience specialising in the provision of executive coaching and leadership development. We work with fast growth SMEs, boards of senior growing SMEs, and also the significant experience with foreign direct investment organisations, and beyond that, both in Northern Ireland and also beyond in terms of global organisations who work across the international matrix. So I guess the reason I'm mentioning that is that we get the challenges which FDI site leads are encountering, and how they have, and the nuances with which you have to engage. And I guess the coaching ultimately is to try to help you navigate that so that you get the best possible strategic results. Our role is to help you tailor the insights from the executive education into something that you can actually work with back in your business. So if you have an insight on, okay, I really need to think more about my stakeholders, it's about, let's do some stakeholder mapping. Let's identify who actually, which stakeholders need your attention, given what you're trying to achieve. And let's practically agree what you're going to do about that, and what conversations you have to have, what meetings you need to attend, etc., etc. Likewise, if you have an insight on your what your unique capability is and how that may inform your value proposition in terms of what makes you special and can help you shine across the group, then our work back in the offices with you is thinking about, okay, let's expand and develop that value proposition and ensure that everybody in the organisation is super clear on what that offer is, what that looks like, and what it means for each person in the business. So very much, I guess, this is the bespoke piece. So yeah, you're all attending the exec ed sessions, but your coach actually attends the executive education session with you. So we're in the room the entire time. So every time you have an insight, and as Paul said, there's maybe you get like a 20-minute best practice input, and then we have breakouts, and you're working with your coach to actually say, okay, so what does this mean for me? How do I actually apply this? What bits of this do I need to take away and do something with? What do I need to shine a light on? What do I need to bring back and discuss with my top team? And what do we need to do in between sessions as your coach, as co-creators of next steps and generating something that's going to deliver results? So the exec coaching, all about that bespoking the learning into what you and your organisation uniquely require. Because what we notice every cohort is that people are at very different stages in terms of their strategic advancement and thinking. Some organisations come with a fairly well fleshed out strategic plan and then completely pivot and realise that actually they've had an insight and they want to shift that. Others are kind of literally starting from scratch in terms of like, we need a plan, we need to know what we're at, we need to demonstrate to the group how we intend to progress, and what our key metrics around that are. So very much this enables us to work with that uniqueness that you bring. So you may well have experienced executive coaching before. We often find that site leads have, because they're part of a wider group, maybe that has sometimes a fairly developed L&D kind of focus. Others haven't, and that's all totally fine. But ultimately, it's space for you to kind of think about, where are we? Where do we need to get to? What's going on? What do we need to do? And then to start to think about the practical steps to enact the change that's required to achieve what you need to achieve. And you have 3 days worth of coaching. That typically starts with one-to-one work with you as the site lead, but typically progresses into us working with you and maybe your top team, because you're not going to achieve whatever you're intending alone. No leader can or will. So it's very much about who do I need to engage as we progress through the programme and as the strategic plan becomes clearer. So very flexible. We're totally flexible. Coaching typically takes place roughly monthly on your side, unless you want off-site. If you're traveling significantly, we can do a hybrid. We can, I have one particular client, they like to check in weekly because they're always all over the place geographically. So very flexible. Our job is to help you kind of make sense of everything that comes up in terms of the current state analysis, which Paul referenced. Where am I now? What does this mean? Where do we need to get to? And to really kind of understand that. We also have some psychometric input, which is very much about helping you to understand, well, how am I showing up as a leader? What strengths should I be leveraging? And is there anything particular that I probably need to focus on or ensure that I've got that gap plugged with people within my team? So very much, as I say, we're with you in the modules and in between the modules. And our role is to kind of support and challenge, hopefully in appropriate measure, not too much of one or other, and very much hold you to account. So if at the end of each session we agree, well, what are you going to do between now and we next meet? I always say that whatever happens in a session should ignite something happening outside of a coaching session back in the workplace. So what are you going to do about it? And we hold you to account each time we meet. Well, how did that go? What did you learn? What were the insights? So what? Who else do you need to engage with? How do you sustain this? How do you embed this, etc.? And it's very much about ensuring that all of this great best practice stuff that you kind of are exposed to actually gets embedded into your organisation where relevant, and that you practically do stuff that moves the dial. Ultimately, as Paul said, the focus is on that strategic growth plan, and we want to ensure that at the end of the programme, so our role is to guide you towards ensuring that you have that robust growth plan, that you're crystal clear on this is what we stand for, this is our purpose organisationally in Northern Ireland, this is our unique capability and value proposition, this is the roadmap. We're really clear on the pillars of growth, how we're going to get there here, and what capabilities are required to make that happen. Finally, we also support the peer learning in that you're getting together in smaller groups of like 4s or 5s and sharing your unique problems that you face. Every year, people say they love this element because it's amazing, no matter whether you're coming from manufacturing, software, professional services. There are those unique aspects which are relevant to all FDI leads, and people really value that kind of mini board where they can get to talk about their specific challenges and how importantly they can share their learning around addressing those challenges. Yeah, I guess in terms of our focus in the coaching, we very much operate systemically, and what I mean by that is our work is not just about it's outside in rather than inside out. There's no point in any leadership development starting with the individual. You're already highly accomplished, successful leaders. If you just polish that leader further, that's not necessarily going to yield that particular systemic impact. So our work is very much encouraging you to think about, what's going on in the wider world in which your organisation and industry is operating. what's coming over the hill that you need to be really mindful of in terms of that horizon scanning. What about your stakeholders? What is it they want and need from you? And therefore, then that should inform how you shape your Northern Ireland jurisdiction, what the top team needs to look like, how your team dynamics and culture needs to play out, and importantly, what relationships you need to major on, and then importantly, what's the shift that's needed in your leadership to ensure that you're best placed to support that organisational shift and progress. So very much encouraging that. This is the team. We all look like really weirdly stretched for some reason, unless it's just how it's showing on my screen. But we've all worked on the programme since the inception. So these guys are professional, accredited, qualified executive coaches who have billions of experience in working very specifically with FDI site leads across literally hundreds of FDIs, organisations, and working with those top teams to build that capability, build the talent that will actually deliver success. Just a couple of things I wanted to reference. Yeah, so a lot of our work, a lot of case studies of participants really working on that, developing a local strategy, and that's encouraging you through coaching to think about things that we've mentioned, like what are we uniquely placed to deliver? That the world of tomorrow needs, but that specifically we are uniquely placed to deliver in Northern Ireland. What does our capability suggest that value proposition should look like? What additional capability might we need? How do we ensure that we are positioned appropriately within the group to ensure that that strategy as well? So for some, it's been, for example, let's set ourselves up as a centre of excellence for innovation, for cybersecurity, for alternative legal services, for whatever, for a specific manufacturing methodology, for a particular part in the wider value chain. But very much about, what is it that our local strategy needs to look like, and how importantly does that feed into that wider strategy? Having defined what that local strategy needs to look like, then a lot of our work is around that. How do you ensure that your culture is one which is actually going to ensure that you're going to deliver on success? And that can be anything from looking at the quality of the leadership, looking at your top team, how cohesive it is, and looking at the rhythm of communications organisationally and whether that's fit for purpose, ensuring that the behaviour and performance is adequately managed, that you've maybe identification of a competence framework that will spell out what successful behaviour needs to look like. So all of these things really important in terms of ensuring that it underpins successful strategic execution. And then every single person in an FDI that we work with, they find this piece so important, which is the how do I influence across the group? And we would do a lot of work in terms of, have you crafted, how compelling and articulate is the narrative which you have crafted, which positions yourself appropriately in terms of what's Northern Ireland's offering. Who are the stakeholders with whom you need to have these conversations? How do you pitch that narrative to ensure that that there is a sense of equity in terms of your voice across the group? How do you manage upwards? How do you ensure that your voice ultimately is heard where it needs heard? And how do you leverage that local capability to ensure that you are positioned appropriately within the group? So that's all about helping you think about your authority, your autonomy, your influence, your decision making, your own executive presence, and how you really are impactful as a leader leading Northern Ireland. So they're just some of the areas where we would often work. These you can read some of the outcomes from previous programmes. As Lawrence mentioned, there's a very comprehensive economic evaluation after every programme, because obviously it's publicly part funded, and these are the outcomes. And every year people say, "Oh my goodness, that really did move the dial on a lot." So that is everything that I wanted to say. I'm going to, again, if you have any questions come up, please do keep putting them in the chat, and we look forward to talking with you shortly. I'm going to hand over to Lawrence for the introductions.
Thank you, Paula. Some really powerful examples of how transformative coaching on the programme can be. So now I'd like to introduce a previous participant on the programme, Mark O'Connell, who's the Northern Ireland Site Lead and SVP Engineering for Evercoat NI Limited. Mark, Thanks for joining us. So we're going to do just a little Q&A around your program journey. So firstly, Mark, could you tell us a little about your company? What do you do? About you? What's your role?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lawrence. Hi, folks. Good morning. EverQuote are an online insurance marketplace, mostly operating in the US market. We started to build our largely engineering office here in Belfast around 2020. So we're operating around sort of 4 or 5 years at this point. We've built the engineering presence here, along with design, along with data science in recent times. And we sort of work into the headquarters there in Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay. So what was your motivation for participating? I'm having trouble with that word, as you can tell this morning, for joining Leading Within a Group, Mark.
Lawrence, it was quite simply to invest in myself and to try and sort of make me a better leader for the people that I had managed to convince to come on to the journey with me in EverQuote. I wanted to make sure that I was doing them justice and investing in myself and making sure I was turning up for them in the best way possible. I think Paula and maybe a few of the other folks there that have spoke so far this morning talked about, lots of leaders will have had coaching and probably some of the training that is focused on leadership. But for me, this course really took 3 different components and really wound them together into one compelling proposition, which is what made me very interested to give that a go and invest my time in it. And that is, obviously, as has been touched on before, it's that one-on-one coaching, it's the peer networking, and it's also the education component of that. I think the power of the course is really winding all 3 of those components together into something that is, frankly, greater than the sum of their parts. So that was what really enticed me onto applying for the course.
Okay. Now, for some, finding time to participate in a program like Leading Within a Group is a perceived barrier. How did you find that?
Yeah, I did. When I first looked at the time commitment that was going to be involved, I did have to obviously move things around a little bit. Most leaders find their calendars pretty hectic, and it's definitely something that I needed to work around and consider at the time. We were encouraged to just block days out and treat it like PTO almost. And I think it's well worth that investment. I know it's difficult. Personally, I know it's difficult to move things and to block those days in your calendar. But the return on that investment, at least in my experience, and I know from the peer networking group, which I still keep in touch with, the return on that investment has been many, many times over. So it's absolutely worth the investment. It's worth really dedicating and focusing your time on the days and the training and of course the coaching as well. So absolutely worth the investment. Okay,
and just on that, in terms of coaching, can you tell me about working with your coach? I think your coach was Paula. And what did you find out about yourself through the coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I had coaching previously in another company, and always found it really useful. I think the difference here was that sort of dedicated time, one-on-one, but then also being able to bring that into the wider leadership team. Certainly working with Paula gave me a lot of insight myself into my own leadership style. And then I suppose developing on that was, well, how does that then sort of play out in my wider leadership team? What sort of influence does that have, in positive or negative? And really helped me, I think, fine tune that and sort of think about that less reactively and much more planful and strategic, and even just in terms of how I'm turning up each day. And then also the opportunity I had with Paula was to expand some of those sessions and some of that time into my broader leadership team, which I think really helped set us up to continue that journey, post the course finishing. It really gave us a bit of foundations to sort of work on and a routine to start implementing, where we could continue to invest time as a leadership group sort of more strategically rather than that sort of tactical reactive nature, which maybe we've been operating in previously. So the coaching was both beneficial to me personally. I wish I could have more of it. But also the wider team, I think, benefited from that as well, which was great.
Okay. And what about the executive education residentials? What did you learn from those?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say, usually I think when leaders are sort of coming onto courses like this, they've probably covered some of these aspects in some regard before. I think what made this different was the actual focused nature of the sessions. The education and the material was expertly delivered. The folks that were talking about it, you could tell, really knew their stuff and really went into, maybe I'll say, scientific detail in each of the aspects, which was awesome to learn from those folks. But there was also a practical element of quite a lot of the courses, which then allowed you to think about, well, how do I bring this into my circumstance? How do I bring this into my company? And how do I make this work for me? And there were a lot of really, really good materials, exercises, tools, and techniques, which I still have the printouts, which I refer to regularly, and we still run some workshops. I do as good a job as the expert trainers on the day, but I try and imitate them best I can. So lots of really practical things that you can take in and actually make work in your own company.
That's great to hear. Now, networking is an important component of leading within a group. How did you find the engagement with your peers?
It was probably, I've spoke very highly of the coaching. I've spoke very highly of the education and the course content as well, Lawrence. But I think the differentiator is possibly the peer networking. That's not something that is as prevalent in other courses that I've seen. The ability to work with a sort of wide variety of peers from various different industries, different levels of experience, and definitely different lenses on problem spaces was really invaluable. The group was a really friendly group. It was great to get to know them, but also to learn from them, because they're obviously experienced leaders in their own regard, and a lot of us share the same issues and problems, and sometimes what works in a different industry actually can be brought in to inspire us to solve issues in our industry as well. So that was amazing. We still keep in contact. Quite a few of us still keep in contact. I think it's probably almost 2 years later, and I still regularly have coffee with some of the folks from my peer network. Interestingly, we still support one another. We actually also help each other when it comes to staffing, which is usually a very competitive area. But actually, it's been something where we've been able to strike partnerships where maybe a particular role works for one company and not the other, and we can help each other out in that regard, which is usually like I said, a very competitive area, and something that leaders among certainly the Belfast software companies don't usually partner in that kind of thing. So that's been a fantastic sort of network for me to tap into, both practically but also from a continued support perspective. So absolutely, I put a big star and a bow on that particular aspect of the course. Okay,
thank you, Mark. And how would you say you're different as a leader? What do you do differently, perhaps post-program?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably lots of little things, Lawrence. I would say, lots of the tools and techniques that I've been able to take away from the experience and the course has been, I'm still using those. We're still working on a lot of those sort of strategic tools that allow us to really position ourselves long term. I think that maybe at a macro level, before attending the course, and it's something that the peer network also alluded to, a lot of us get into this day-to-day habit of just trying to keep the ship, afloat, we react to things that are coming in each day. We're trying to position ourselves in the right way. We try and make sure that we're doing the right thing for our company and our people. But quite often we find ourselves in that trap of reacting to things. And I think the course, and it's a combination of all the aspects I've mentioned before, but also actually just taking those days away from work and focusing your time to really think about things more strategically and longer term. Of course, that's what leaders should be doing regardless. But I think the sort of practical aspects of the course really help me focus on that and double down on that. And certainly that's something I've been very keen to try and continue to exercise, because you can always fall back into the trap again. But that's definitely something that I've taken away from it. I think the other sort of aspect, of course, is, you know, that the importance of that networking group also awoke me to the fact that maybe I needed to invest a little bit more in networking. Maybe there is actually some practical aspects of making some friends in the industry and getting to know other people and learning the sort of approaches they might have to various issues that are quite often shared across the board. So lots of little things, but I think the main takeaway for me is sort of getting yourself out of that reactive nature day and daily.
Okay. So if I can ask you, Mark, what did participation in leading within a group mean for Everquote? What did you achieve as a company?
No, obviously, I think just me having a little more self-awareness is hopefully having a more positive impact on those around me. So that'll be one thing for sure. The practical exercise that the course concluded with, where we present our business plan going forward. You know, Lawrence, I was convinced that I had the business plan in my head already. Coming into the course, I was like, you know, this is not going to change, but it did change, and it changed through all of the sort of aspects of the course that I've mentioned before. It changed because I'm looking at things more strategically now. It was a completely different lens that I ended up looking at my company through by the end of the course. Also hearing from other leaders as well and what worked for them and where they, you know, how things played out for them. The business plan, to get real practical, the business plan actually identified that for our particular business, we're a very data-centric business, and the sort of company that I had formed in Belfast to date actually was focusing on the engineering and product side, but not the data side. For us to have a bigger impact and a bigger influence on the company, it became clear during the course and creating that business plan that actually that's where we should, you know, have more influence. So 2 years later, we actually now have a data engineering team, a data science team, and an analytics team here in Belfast that maybe we wouldn't have had it not been for the influence the course had on me and the, you know, all the various aspects. So I think that's been a real tangible outcome. The team that we've built here in Belfast are making a huge difference to our bottom line, and they've identified lots of innovations and lots of solutions that have really helped Everquote drive forward. So it's been a big impact in that regard as well.
Okay, that is truly great to hear, and you'll be glad to hear that this is your final question. How would you sum up your experience of participating in leading within a group, both personally and professionally?
I don't say it lightly, but I don't think there has been another program or a course that has had a bigger impact on me professionally and personally. I didn't expect that. Frankly, I didn't expect as big an impact going in. I sort of went in thinking, yeah, look, this seems a little bit unique. There's various aspects of this course I haven't seen elsewhere. But, you know, maybe you sort of go into it a little bit more cautious, and you think, well, there's going to be a couple of things I'm going to take away from this, and I'll learn something. I'll continue to invest in myself. But actually, the course had a much bigger impact than I initially expected, and absolutely would recommend it to anyone. And really, you know, if you are doing it, I would say really, you know, dive deep into it, immerse yourself in it, take the time, make sure you focus, take it all in, and make the most of the opportunity, because, you know, it really is an opportunity for leaders to invest in themselves, and, you know, really take away some sort of lifelong lessons that they can continue to apply professionally, and also build personal relationships and have fun while you're doing it. So, yeah.
Okay, Mark, thank you once again. So very much, really great stuff. Glad to hear such a positive journey and experience and the impact the program has had on you. So I think we'll move to questions at this point, guys. And you can pitch a question to Paul, to Paula, Mark, and myself. And I see we have a few questions already. Paul, one for you. Can you tell me who will be delivering the executive education at the residentials?
Sure, Lawrence. So as I said when I was talking about the Irish Management Institute, the delivery approach is to use associates, a network of associates, people who are specialists in their areas who are brought in because of that specialization. The emphasis on this program is very much on people also with practical management experience. So if I give a couple of examples, maybe it's the best way of handling the question. So in the first residential, we have a day on subsidiary strategy. I deliver that session myself. It's a topic that I've developed an interest in through my work as part of a multinational. I spent 30 years with IBM in a senior leadership position. I was heavily involved in creating a strategy there to encourage more inward investment by the corporation and to steer those investments through to growth. So that's where I developed an interest in it, and since I left the company, I studied it more at master's and PhD level, and I wrote a book on the subject, which everybody on the program will get a copy of as well as a backup. So that's kind of the classic example of the mix of kind of let's say more academic material, but what's selected academic material from a practical perspective. So that's why I'm one of the deliverers. The second day in the first residential is on value, where we use Professor John Fahey from University of Limerick. John is an expert on marketing, but primarily on value and value proposition development. So that's why we use him, and he's also helped us on a number of these programs over the years. So I won't go through all the names in answer to the question, but I'll just give people that flavor of that mix of deep expertise coupled with practical experience. Even more academically oriented people like John Fahey, they have to have a track record of having worked with companies on successful projects in these areas. So that's very much the emphasis. I hope that answers the question, but I'm happy to take follow-ons if anyone wants to put them in the chat.
Absolutely. Okay. For the moment, thank you, Paul. Paula, your turn. Can you please tell me how my coach is allocated on the program?
Yes. So I personally, leading the team, look after the coach allocations. And when you apply to the program, you submit an application form to Invest in I, and you have an opportunity to highlight what you're hoping to achieve from the program, what particular challenges you're facing. And we look at that in the round. Sometimes I'll have a follow-up conversation with you and then allocate one of the dedicated coach team who seems to best fit. And it sounds like quite an intuitive process, but who seems to best fit the challenges which you're encountering. So there's some, whether that's because of your industry sector, but more importantly, because maybe of things that you've highlighted. Say, for example, one of your key observations is that you need to develop a more competent and cohesive top team to support what you're trying to achieve locally. It may be that there's one particular coach who may be best placed to support you with that. So it is looking at a combination of the factors that you put forward. So the more information you can provide us with, the better. But it is a dedicated team. They've all worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of FDI site leads and local boards, and more internationally as well. So they're all super capable, and they're all very able to develop that rapport. I always check in with everyone after their first session just to ensure that rapport has happened, and so far no one's ever wanted to change. Well, one person did once, because they said I had expected a woman and I got a man, and it was a man. But that's nothing to do with my team capability. Hopefully that answers the question. But we typically have follow-up conversations with you to ensure that you're clear. But they're all, as I say, really everyone in the team can work with anyone. We deliberately don't do those chemistry sessions because of that very capability. You know, everybody can build rapport with everyone, and we'll be working closely as a group across the program anyway. So we often do guest coaching as well, where maybe if you're talking with one of the other coaches and there's something specifically that you'd like them to work with, we do guest coach swaps. So I'm very flexible.
Okay. Maybe just I'll pitch a supplementary to you. Some people are thinking about it's not just them, it's their wider team. Can you just maybe spend a minute or so explaining just how participants can bring other members of the senior leadership team as appropriate into maybe that coaching relationship?
Absolutely. So on anything that we identify in coaching, which is an action, a plan, an intention, the question is always, well, who do we need to involve to make this reality? And typically, as Mark said, you know, it's going to be, you know, it's okay, let's have a team session then, and that will become a team coaching session, whether that's actually looking at how that team becomes more of a high performing team, or whether it's, you know, actually about that team developing as a team, or whether it's that the entire top team or other players within the business get involved in that coaching session where we're looking at, for example, let's flesh out this value proposition. What does it look like? I mean, that's nothing that should be done by the site lead alone. So anything which requires that buy-in, involvement, and collaborative insight, we always go wider. Okay. Other ones in which we involve the wider team. For example, on the current programme, we've had a few people who few participants have asked if they can have like a 360. So I've met with, for example, someone I'm working with, I've met with all of their key players across the business, not in Northern Ireland, but just to actually really understand, you know, what's unique about this individual, what would better look like in terms from a developmental perspective. And then we've fed that in, and that's been really powerful. So we basically engage with any stakeholders that you believe, you know, you're in the steering seat, but you as the participant, anyone you think is going to be valuable to helping progress things, then we will work with you with them.
Okay. For the moment, Paula, thank you again. Guys, just to say, do submit any questions. We're obviously hitting the mark in terms of everything we're telling you about the programme. But if there are any further questions, do use the chat facility and we'll come to those. Mark, you're up next. What would you say was the best thing about participating on this programme?
Well, I've got to say Paula as my coach, don't I? Because I'm not right here.
Oh, amazing.
You know, joking aside, absolutely, the coaching, the one-on-one coaching was fantastic. It's hard to say one element. I do think the coaching was very impactful for me personally, and also my wider team. But I also have mentioned before that sort of differentiator of that peer networking group as well. I think that's, you know, both of those aspects have a long-lasting impact. If you're able to maintain those relationships long term, there's a lot of value in that.
Okay. It just remains for me to thank my co-presenters, to Paul, Paula, and Mark, to Kathy and Brona, Barry, and Claire for helping with the session today, and for all of you for joining us this morning. Thank you.